Hi, Joe Smiles here. So today I'm going to talk about my number one tip on safely deadlifting. This is part one of part 8 of my number one tip. What you want to do is you want to make sure that for longevity of deadlifting, you keep your pelvis in an anterior position and you brace your abdominal muscles as though you're laughing or someone's going to punch you in the tummy, Valsalvic maneuver. And you want to keep that engaged the whole time. So when you lift the bar off the floor, you arch the back so you've got lumbar lordosis, brace the tummy muscles. As soon as you feel that your abdominal muscles cave in like this, you lose the tightness in your abdominal muscles and your pelvis tucks under like this, you stop the deadlift straight away and you put it down, because you can't carry on any more sets, any more reps, because your musculature of your lower back and abdominal muscles can't maintain the neutral or lordotic position of your pelvis, of your lumbar spine, and therefore a anterior tilt of your pelvis. So your back will start rounding, which then increases chances of injuries. Okay, so part 2 of 8 of my number one tip for safely deadlifting. Putting aside the biopsychosocial model of pain, which means pain is caused by biological reasons such as genetics, injury risk, immune system, biomechanics of movement patterns, posture, alcohol, smoking, obesity, age, and putting aside psychological problems of pain such as cognition, the way you think, the way you behave, catastrophizing, the personality, beliefs and around pain and avoidance of pain and fear of pain, and then the social side of pain, which is social expectations, social support structures, friends, family, how they interact with your pain, and also cultural differences. What we're going to do is we're going to focus on pain, which is biological, and in this case the biomechanical failure of during the deadlift. So the reason being is that the poor deadlift technique means that the lumbar flexion is well documented in the literature as being a mechanism of injury to the lower back. That's even without the psychological, the psycho, and the sociological, the social side of the biopsychosocial model of the pain. When your tissues can't support the load directly, then you lose lumbar lordosis and then your lower back goes into flexion, and there's plenty of evidence that that is the case. And before anyone says that the world's strongest men lift the Atlas stones with a rounded back, no, it's not the same biomechanical technique as a deadlift. Let's look at Tom Stoltman from Scotland lifting a world record of 273 kilo stone.
These are special events, but it still draws some of the greatest athletes. Wow, right off the ground. Wow. 6. Wow. Oh my goodness. Wow. That was astounding.
Okay, so firstly, he's just lifting around or just above 50% of his 1 rep max. So his tissues are well within the load capacity that they can handle. So he's not going to 1 rep max or a rep in reserve to failure on a 3 to 6 rep deadlift or something like that. He's not accumulating fatigue. Secondly, he's only initially bending the lower back where the stone is close to his center of gravity than a deadlift where the bar is out in front of you, and he's only pulling the stone to his knees, and then he's squatting back and rolling the stone onto his thighs, and then he's actually squatting. The third part of the lift is he's squatting up, so his pelvis and his lower back initially are in a set position and they don't move from that position. As soon as he gets to his knees, he just bends his knees and his hips, goes down into a deep squat, and then his lower back and pelvis is pretty much in a neutral position. So completely different to a deadlift. And when you're deadlifting to 1 rep max or 1 rep in reserve, the list of potential injuries that can increase the chances of injuring your lower back when you do flex, and I'll go through those now. Okay, part 3 of 8 of my number one tip on safely deadlifting. Facet joint strain, it's an injury mechanism. The zygapophyseal joints, which are these joints here which go onto each vertebrae, between each vertebrae. This is on my girlfriend Sandra, who used to be called Sam, but we'll just call her Sandra for now. These joints can get sprained. They can get injured. Study 1 entitled Biomechanics of the Lumbar Facet Joint 2020 explains that both flexion and extension can cause strain to these joints, and also they can cause spondylolisthesis, which is when normally at L5, S1, the vertebral body slides forward on top of the bottom one, and this can be in conjunction with pars intra-articularis, which is spondylolysis, where you can have a fracture in the pars intra-articularis. Spondylolysis can be in conjunction with or without spondylolisthesis. Okay, repeatedly overstraining the facet joints can lead to facet joint syndrome, and this can occur from age, obesity, trauma, such as overuse injury on deadlifts, genetics, and excessive flexion and extension. Okay, let's rattle through this still. Part 4 of 8 of my number 1 tip on safely deadlifting. Muscle strain and is an injury mechanism. You have 3 layers of spinal erectors that come down each side of the spinal vertebrae. They can tear at the musculoskeletal musculotendinous junction, where they attach onto the pelvis and sacrum. This normally happens when the pelvis goes into a posterior tilt and the lower back goes into a flex position, because it stretches the muscle, which then in turn causes a muscle strain. Study 2 entitled Mechanical Low Back Pain 2018 explains that 70% of low back pain is from lumbar strains, i.e. a stretch injury to the lumbar musculature or connective tissue, which includes the ligaments. So this can be also common when you're flexing and posteriorly tilting under load like a deadlift. Moving on to part 5 of 8 of my number 1 tip on deadlifting. So ligament strains as a injury mechanism. So when the lumbar spine flexes and under submaximal or maximal loads, it increases the chances of ligament strains. Okay, we have the supraspinous ligament goes from the apices, or the ends of the spinous processes, here to here to here to here, and they go all the way from C7 all the way to L3, L4, and they resist lumbar flexion, and they can get strained. Then you have one in from that, you have the interspinous ligament that goes from the inside of the spinous process, from each spinous process, and that also can get strained from over flexion of the lumbar spine. C1 all the way down to sacral 1, that interspinous ligament. Okay, the ligamentum flavum attaches to the lamina, which is right inside here, and it goes all the way from C1 all the way down to S1, which is down here, and it also resists spinal flexion but can get strained when the lumbar spine gets into flexion under load. And finally, the posterior longitudinal ligament, which is right inside here on the posterior wall of each vertebrae, runs all the way down from C2 to the posterior sacrum. The posterior longitudinal ligament, because it attaches to the posterior side of the vertebrae, it also attaches to the posterior annulus fibrosus, which is the ring of cartilage, collagen fibers of each each disc. It resists flexion and resists any bulging of the discs, but can get strained under load. Okay, moving on to part 6 of 8 of my number 1 tip on safely deadlifting. So we've got disc bulges and herniations as a injury mechanism. It's well documented that lumbar flexion with or without rotation increases the chances of a disc bulge or herniation. That's where the annulus fibrosus, so the outer ring of collagen, diffuses and bulges. It can bulge on or not on a nerve. The nucleus propulsus, which is the part inside the disc, gel inside the disc, it can protrude and come out of the bulge outside of the annulus fibrosus and cause a herniation. Okay, study 3 entitled Acute Physiological Response to Lumbar Intervertebral Discs to High Load Deadlift Exercise 2021. It showed that after deadlifting using MRI scans, the L5 S1 disc partially showed decrease in water content. So the findings show that the more mechanical stress results from less water diffusion into the disc from high load deadlifts. And this considering that L5 S1 disc is at the high incidence risk for intervertebral degeneration and herniation. So we should pay special attention for this region to be held in as much of a neutral position as possible during high load exercise to prevent lumbar injuries. Study 4, entitled Long-Term Effects of Lumbar Flexion versus Extension Exercises for Chronic Axial Load Back Pain, a randomized control trial 2024, showed that lumbar extension exercise was more effective than flexion exercise after 1 year or up to 1 year for reducing lower back pain. It also helped to reduce radiating pain down the leg, into extension more, and this is a randomized control trial, so it's a very good trial. Repetitive flexion movement was found of the lumbar spine to lead to posterior displacement of the nucleus propulsus, which is the gel inside the disc, and thinning of the posterior, so the rear part of the annulus fibrosus, and this increases the chances of a herniation or a disc bulge, or an annular tear, where you get a tear in the annulus. Study 5, entitled Lower Back Biomechanics During Repetitive Deadlifts, a Narrative Review 2022. It showed that fatigue-induced changes in deadlift posture can further increase spinal loads from compressive and shearing forces, and therefore increase the risk of lower back injury, specifically when you're fatigue induced and your trunk goes into flexion repeatedly during a heavy deadlifting, especially when the demands on the external trunk musculature like the rectus abdominis and the spinal erectors become over fatigued. And maintaining postural control is fundamental for injury prevention, is what they concluded. Rattling on to part 7 of 8 of my #1 tips on deadlifting. Do discs adapt to lumbar flexion load like muscles adapt load? The quick answer is no. So study 6, entitled Can Exercise Positively Influence the Intervertebral Disc 2016, it showed that dynamic axial loading of slow to moderate exercises like walking and jogging can increase adaptation to the disc, where proteoglycans go into the disc. Those are protein molecules that fill the extracellular matrix of the annulus fibrosus. However, the discs don't adapt to things like flexion, torsional loading, compression, high impact sports like weightlifting, swimming, basketball, rowing, horse riding, and those activities can be catabolic. In other words, they can lead to progressive disc degeneration. Study 7, entitled Does Intervertebral Disc Adapt to Load 2022? It showed that the nucleus propulsus inside this disc has no blood supply, no nerve supply, and the annulus fibrosus, the outer disc, part of the disc, has almost avascular, so almost no blood supply. So it relies on being used a pump action of proteoglycans into the disc. It's been found that it cannot remodel and adapt like musculature or bone, and the discs can have irreversible damage. Therefore, just because exercise increases proteoglycans doesn't mean that the disc is positively adapting to the stress. The association is not a causation. Study 8, entitled Patterns of Intervertebral Disc Alteration in Asymptomatic Elite Rowers 2022, showed that if the disc was truly adapting, we wouldn't see an overwhelming amount of research showing that high prevalence of disc degeneration in rowers. And also the authors say that intense exercise is associated with early degenerative changes including disc herniation. And study 9, entitled To Flex or Not to Flex, is there a relationship between lumbar spine flexion during lifting and low back pain? A systematic review meta-analysis 2020 showed that there's no evidence that lumbar flexion should be minimized while lifting to prevent lower back pain. However, in this study, the participants only lifted a pen and up to 12 kilos, and a pen is obviously less than what a beginner can deadlift, and it's also what's less than manual workers are allowed to lift when they're manually working, which is up to 23 kilos. And finally, part 8 of my #1 tip on deadlift. So to conclude, my advice is, if you're repeatedly deadlifting to maximal or submaximal lifts where you're going 1 or 2 reps in reserve to failure, you want to keep your lower back and your pelvis in a lordotic position, and you want to maintain an anterior tilt and a neutral position when you're at the top, anterior tilt on the way down, descending and ascending. And once you can no longer keep the Valsalvic maneuver or the abdominal muscle tightness, and it collapses or caves in, then that's going to start causing your lower back to flex and your pelvis to go into a posterior tilt, and that will dramatically increase the chances of soft tissue injury or disc injury, and therefore you should stop the deadlift. Thanks for listening. Please like the video, make any comments you want, and please subscribe, and I'll keep giving as many educational videos as I can. Thanks for listening.